East is kind of an artifact, a geopolitical artifact. You could just as easily call them Northeast Africa, because geologically that is exactly what it is. But without going into making any further geopolitical statements, it would make sense that if that is the corridor out of which human beings migrated out of Africa, you would find evidence, non-African evidence of early human beings there first before you found them anywhere else, and that is where you find them, at least where out of Africa is concerned. All this goes back to my point, is that for 100,000 years, the story of humanity, that is modern human beings, us, 5.5 billion of us, was an African story and an African story alone, as far as we can determine. Now, what is my point about this? What does this have to do with our subject? It's just this. One of the things that distinguished human beings, modern human beings, from their ancestors, their hominid, pre-human ancestors, was this instrument we call the brain, giving it powers, this new animal on the face of the earth, powers of analysis, discrimination, reflection, quantification, comparison, comparative analysis, which enabled it to produce its greatest product, which is culture. So that the first experiments in what we would call the development or elaboration of human culture would have also occurred in Africa. Which is to say, culture and its products as human beings is also African first before it is anything else. It only stands to reason, which is to say language, myth, symbol, religion, philosophy, science, technology would have begun in Africa before you would find it anywhere else, quite logically, because that's where human beings were. And they were there only for tens of thousands of years. Surprise. That the first evidence of advanced human culture doesn't also indeed appears in Africa first. For example, we know as a matter of fact that 40,000 years ago in Swaziland, Africans were mining iron ore. We know as a matter of fact 28,000 years ago, Africans in what is now Zambia were mining manganese. I mean, not just digging them up, mining, actually having mining works. There is powerful evidence, almost to a certainty, that the domestication of animals, which was one of the other steps that led human beings to settled communities, occurred in Kenya about 18,000 years ago. The evidence is also very suggestive that 15,000 years ago, or 17,000 years ago, agriculture began also in the Nile Valley before it began anywhere else. The evidence for that is mainly that in certain sites in what is now northern Sudan and what is called upper or southern Egypt, there are areas where there was obviously human habitations with thousands upon thousands of grinding stones, sickles, and all of the instruments that you need for grinding grain. Now, some have tried to say, well, this, they could have been harvesting wild grain, except for one thing. The sheer numbers make that impossible. Wild grain cannot support more than a few people over a long period of time. This particular area was inhabited for year after year after year after year, and they had thousands upon thousands of grinding stones, meaning that they would have had to have been harvesting large quantities of grain, which in and itself suggests, most powerfully, that they had invented agriculture 15,000, 16,000 years ago. And by the way, agriculture was probably a female invention, paving the way towards civilization. The most single important invention in the history of civilization, making it possible. Now, all that to say is that the proto-technology necessary for the eventual creation of high culture or civilization, again, we find it in sequence in Africa before we find it anywhere else. Now, it isn't just proto-technology we're talking about. We're even talking about intellectual culture. This is the Ashango bone, discovered in Zaire, it's about 10,000 years old. It demonstrates, for one thing, a counting and numerical system, a binary counting and numerical system. It is also apparently a lunar calendar. So here we see, shall we say, the prototypes of science also making their appearance in Africa before they appear anywhere else in what is now Zaire. Oh, goodness, I'm afraid of this. This is the title page from the Rind Mathematical Papyrus. Unfortunately, it's on its side, so you almost have to turn over like that to see it. I apologize. Nonetheless, This early, shall we say, mathematical experiments or mathematical speculations give rise in the lower Nile Valley in what is now Egypt, or at that time ancient Egypt, 4,000 years ago, to mathematics as a coherent, cohesive discipline. Mathematics did not begin with the Greeks, even the Greeks say so. Geometry was an African invention. And Pythagoras admitted as much. And so did everybody who came after him. This is a written mathematical papyrus that is 4,000 years old. This is the title page. I'm just going to read you the translation of the title page. The entrance into the knowledge of all existing things and obscure secrets. Interesting title page for a mathematical treatise. We find in the Rind mathematical papyrus, we find formulas for the area of the rectangle, which is problem number 6. This is the Rind mathematical papyrus. There are, I think, 4 mathematical papyri that have been discovered. One is the Moscow mathematical papyrus, showing you the area of a rectangle, or the formula for obtaining the area of a rectangle, A equals L times B. This is problem number 14 of the Moscow papyrus. This is the formula for finding the volume of a truncated pyramid. Now, the volume for a truncated pyramid gives you volume equals height, 1/3 the height, times a squared, ab plus b squared. This is actually more difficult than finding the volume of the total pyramid. So if they could, check on the job says, he who can do more can do less. So if they can find the volume of the truncated pyramid, they also knew the volume of the pyramid, how to find the volume of the pyramid. 1/3 the height times area squared. This is problem number 56, also from the Rind mathematical papyrus. This is a problem that allows them to demonstrate how to find the slope of the pyramid. And in this problem, they actually deal with cotangents, showing that they had also not only begun their studies in geometry, but also in trigonometry as well. Among these ancient people of the Nile, these ancient black peoples of the Nile, we find the first evidence of algebra, because in the Rind mathematical papyruses, number 24 to 27, are algebraic equations of the first degree. They also handled algebraic equations of the second degree. Algebra is basically, if you have to strip it down to its essentials, its ability to solve problems when you have an unknown. Now, we call that unknown usually x or y. The ancient Camites used to call it a quantity. This is problem 51 of the Rind mathematical papyrus, showing finding the area of a triangle. Basically, area equals 1/2 the base times the height. Problem number 50, which we don't have up here, the ancient Camites were also able to find the area of a hemisphere, which is, in modern notation, area equals 2 times pi times r squared, which means that they could also find the area of a sphere, which is 4 pi r squared. They also, therefore, if they knew that much, they knew the area of the circle. And the area of the circle, as we know, is pi r squared. The Rind mathematical, our modern value for pi is 3.14128. The ancient Camite value for pi was 3.1605. People have tried to say that the Babylonians had a higher level of mathematics than the ancient Egyptians, and yet the best that the Babylonians could come up with for a value of pi was 3. Now, the ancient Egyptians actually had what we can only describe as understanding arithmetic and geometrical progressions, which is to say that they knew, in order to find an arithmetical progression, that S, which is the sum of n terms, equals n over 2 times 2a, where a is the first and lowest term, plus n minus 1, plus d, where d is the common difference. They also understood geometrical progressions. We know it in the problem of the Hecat, where a geometrical term is the following, or a geometrical progression is this. To find the sum of the geometrical progression whose first term is 7 and whose common ratio is 7. Now, those of you who read Mother Goose lately will remember the Mother Goose rhyme, as I was going to St. Ives. As I was going to St. Ives, I met a man with 7 wives. Each wife had 7 sacks. Each sack had 7 cats. Each cat had 7 kids. Kids, cats, sacks, wives. How many were going to St. Ives? This is a geometrical progression that you find in the Wren mathematical papyrus 4,000 years earlier. In the problem of the Heka, instead of using wives, he said 7 houses. Each house had 7 cats. Each cat had 7 mice. And each mice had 7 spelt. And they went one further. They went to a 5th progression. Each spelt had 7 hekats. So they went to progression out to 16,807. So the idea, as Gilling says, that the ancient Kamites did not understand the theoretical applications of the mathematics that they invented is merely a conceit. It has nothing to do with the reality. So, the Great Pyramid. We're only going to say a little bit about the Great Pyramid. Certainly the grandest edifice of its kind ever created by the hand of man. Just want to say I just want to point out 2 things about the Great Pyramid. 483 feet in height. The base of the pyramid is 13 acres in area. It was built out of 2.7 million blocks of stone. The lightest stone was 1 ton. The heaviest was 7 tons. Planed to such a smoothness that when they were fitted together, if you plucked the hair out of your head, you could not fit it between the joints. Oriented precisely to the 4 cardinal points. The descending passage was built at 3 degrees 43 minutes in slope. Oriented exactly to Alpha Draconis, which shone down at 3340 BC, 3340 BC, and it won't shine it down again until 26,000 years later. The height of the pyramid, if you multiply it by 1 billion, gives you the mean distance between Earth and Sun. People say that's a coincidence. Well, as has been said, a coincidence is merely something that happens that you can't explain, that you haven't determined what the cause and effect is. Very strange coincidence. The Kamites did not understand the theoretical applications of the mathematics that they invented is merely a conceit. It has nothing to do with the reality. So, I am fond of asking young black students is, why are you afraid of mathematics? Why do you run away from mathematics and physics? Africa invented mathematics and physics. That isn't my opinion, that just happens to be the reality. I didn't make it happen. That just happens to be the way it is. And the Greeks themselves say so, not once, not twice, but at least a dozen times. All the Greek mathematicians studied in Egypt. Eudoxus, Archimedes, Hipparchus, Pythagoras, Thales, Plato. In fact, the Greeks were in a habit, if they didn't study in Egypt, they would say they would in order to give themselves credibility. Okay, good. This is the interior of the Grand Gallery, showing how it would have been used to measure the time of movement of the stars across this particular area. And it would have therefore given them some way of measuring the minute of arc. The Great Pyramid, I can't speak for the other pyramid, was not just a pile of rock created to the vanity of a certain pharaoh, as sort of our... This was found nearly 2,400 years ago in Alexandria in Egypt. People for a long time, it's dated that time, it was found 100 years ago. People thought it was a bird for a long time until a NASA engineer says, well, look, no bird has that kind of a body. No bird has reverse dihedral wings, and what you can't see is no bird has a vertical tail. He says what this was 2,400 years ago is a glider, an aerodynamically sound glider. Now, don't come out of here and say Dr. Finch says that the Egyptians invented powered flight, that they beat the Wright brothers by 2,400 years. And I'm not saying that, but they were experimenting with aerodynamics, aeronautics, 2,400 years ago. As I am fond of saying, to quote Solomon, there's nothing new under the sun, or the Finch corollary is, the only thing that's new is that which has been forgotten. Didn't just happen in ancient Egypt, even after Egypt had left the historical scene. This is a iron smelter from Tanzania, going back 2,000 years, able to achieve temperatures of over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperatures not possible in Europe even 100 years ago, or 120 years ago. In fact, East Africa was known for the quality of its iron and steel. It was called wood steel because the Indians, that is from the continent of India, used to import the steel to make their famous Damascus swords. Damascus swords weren't actually from Damascus. So we see that either technological prowess was evident in Africa outside of Egypt as well. Now, let me see. I think I got another slide here on this. Yes. I think they stopped doing this about 500 years ago, but they preserved it in their oral traditions. In other words, how to build one of these smelters, which is built out of termite mud. They use termite mud because it's impermeable to water. Now, it's very interesting. During World War II, of course, there was no commerce back and forth to Africa, so Africa went into an acute iron shortage and steel shortage because they've been getting it from Europe. Well, from their oral traditions alone, they reconstructed the smelter and then proceeded to produce their own iron and steel. The famous Dogon of Mali, a so-called Neolithic people, supposedly without intellectual culture, and yet they were able to describe the star Sirius, the brightest star in the heavens outside of the solar system, in the southern heaven. They not only described Sirius, but they described, and had been describing for 700 years, a small companion star, which is a white dwarf, which is called Sirius B, first discovered in Europe in 1862. Not only did they know that Sirius B was a near invisible white dwarf, and therefore that it was heavy, but they knew its periodicity around Sirius A, which is 50 years. They even say that there is another star orbiting around Sirius, but that we know is there, but we haven't found it yet. Now, these are people supposedly without telescopes, without technology. In fact, an MIT professor looked at this information and said, these people had no business knowing any of this. In so-called darkest Africa, a people who invented nothing, created nothing, explored nothing, and yet they have an astronomical knowledge that had only a level that had only been achieved in Europe in the last century, at least as it concerns the Sirius star system. They also describe, by the way, the 4 moons around Jupiter, the Saturn's rings. They describe the Milky Way and the spiral galaxy that spin at incredible speed away from the center of the universe. This is a diagram of the Dogon version of the orbit of Sirius B around Sirius A, and that's a modern astronomical diagram on the right. And this is what they call a linear extension model on the left, based on the African model of path of Sirius A and Sirius B, and the right is a modern astronomical diagram which is absolutely the same all the way out to 1990. Now, what is fascinating to me about the Dogon, among the many things that fascinate me about them, is they have 4 calendars. A calendar based on the sun, the moon, Sirius, and a 4th one based on the cycles of Venus. you see, people take calendars for granted. We think calendars are something to tell you the months of the year, the days of the week, what season you're in, and you don't understand that the calendar was probably the first great intellectual achievement of mankind, or humankind. Because in order to invent a precise and accurate calendar, you have to know the precise movements and predict the precise movements of whatever heavenly body is the basis of your calendar, whether it be sun, moon, or stars. So that means a long period of astronomical observation, accurate observation, preserving the record of your observations, and being able to predict your celestial movements. It looks as if that the ancient Kamites and by the way, the Dogon too, also had a calendar based on a 26,000-year cycle we call the precession of the equinox. Okay, this is Johns Hopkins Medical School. I'm a physician. There are a lot of physicians in the room. Let's get down to the pièce de résistance, one of my favorite subjects, the African background of medical science. This book has 3 essays on the subject. There are a total of 8 essays. 3 of them are on this subject. And why don't we get to it without any further ado or delay? This is a hieroglyphic sign, Sunu or Swenwe, which means in the ancient Kamite language, the physician. Now, this is the god Thoth, or Tahuti in ancient Kamite. He is a god of mind, will, and intelligence. He's the mind of science and learning, and he is the god of medicine, the first such god of medicine, 2,000 to 4,000 years before Hermes. Hermes, the Greek god of medicine, is, in fact, a later Greek version of Thoth. And those physicians and people who work in the health-related field in the room know that the modern symbol of medicine certainly throughout all the Western world, and somewhere you could find it somewhere here in Johns Hopkins University, of course, is the so-called caduceus, the staff with a snake twined around it. And we say that comes from Hermes. There it is, 2,000 years before Hermes. And so our modern symbol of medicine is an ancient African symbol that has come down unbroken over a period of 4,000 to 6,000 years. The only thing that's new is that which has been forgotten. Can I have the next one? Hippocrates. As I like to say, I have not come to bury Hippocrates, but to praise him. Whatever he was, however, he was not the father of medicine. He would never have had the temerity or the audacity to call himself the father of medicine. He has had, however, a profound influence over medicine over the last 2,500 years, and you would think that somebody with that much influence and that much who sort of is part of not only the history but really the folklore of modern medicine would be a clear-cut historical person. But perhaps folklore is suggestive because we don't know very much about him. When you look closely at him, he kind of recedes into the mist like a ghost. We only know 3 things about him. He was born on the island of Kos in eastern Aegean. He was a descendant from a line of Asclepian priests. Asclepios, it was the Greek god of medicine. And there is no reason to doubt, a physician of unusual and outstanding gifts. No reason to doubt that whatsoever. He was so great as a physician that a school grew up around him. However, he did not even write a fraction of the so-called Hippocratic written corpus. He did not even compose the Hippocratic Oath. And if anyone had put to him or asked him who is the father of medicine, he would have echoed his countryman Homer, who 500 years earlier said that in medicine, Egypt leaves the rest of the world behind. So I only want to put Hippocrates in the proper historical perspective. That is all. If there is such thing as a father of medicine, it is this man or it is no one, Imhotep. Even though he lived 3,000 years before Hippocrates, we actually know more about him than we know about Hippocrates. We knew who his parents were. We knew where he was born, where he was raised, what he did. He was, as Sir William Osler, and this was Osler's institution right here. Osler practically founded this institution, did he not? Osler said of Imhotep, and by the way, Osler himself was, I've read some books by Osler. Osler was no joke. He was real. He was a real Renaissance physician, one of the last in this country anyway. And what does he say about Imhotep? The first figure of a physician to stand out clearly from the mists of antiquity. Or as I like to call him, the first universal genius of whom we have any knowledge. He was prime minister under Joseph, so therefore a statesman. He was renowned as a philosopher and a purveyor of oral wisdom. He was an architect of genius, having designed and built the step pyramid of Saqqara, but above all, he was a divinely gifted physician. So great was his renown as a physician that by the 6th century BC, he became deified as a physician and worshipped by the Greeks, including Hippocrates, because Asclepios was identified with Imhotep. So when you worship Asclepios, you would worship Imhotep. So in the Hippocratic Oath, when the physician says, I swear by the god Apollo and I swear by the god Imhotep, swear by Asclepios, he is in fact swearing by Imhotep. Imhotep, if he had done nothing else in the world but designed and built this temple complex, his fame would be indelible and assured. But beyond that, he was even more renowned as a physician. I'm sorry Dr. Watkins had to leave, because if he didn't already know it, and he already might, it is in ancient Cam, 6,000 years ago, that the first systematic studies of cardiovascular circulation and cardiovascular physiology began. There is something called the Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus, about 6,000 years old, which I call the founding document of scientific medicine, in which are described the heart as the center of the circulatory system, the major vessels going out of the heart and into the periphery and into the vital organs, the movement of blood out of the heart, the phenomenon of pulsation that occurs as a result of the movement of blood outside the heart, the measuring of the pulse itself, which Hippocrates, by the way, did not do, the understanding a relationship between the heart and the lung, heart and the kidneys, and even the heart and the liver. The physicians in the room know what I mean when I talk about passive congestion of the liver as a result of congestive heart failure. Ancient Egyptians described that. They described angina pectoris. They even described Stokes-Adams attacks. What is a Stokes-Adams attack? Some people can get heart dysrhythmias. Those dysrhythmias cause a slowing down of blood to the brain, and the person can pass out, simply put. The ancient Egyptians described that, not only in the, not in the Edwin Smith Papyrus, but in the Ebers Papyrus. So that cardiovascular physiology and cardiovascular pathology and cardiovascular medicine begins in Africa 6,000 years ago. And I think Johns Hopkins is one of the world's centers of cardiovascular medicine, if I'm not mistaken. Don't even know. They owe a debt to ancient black people living on the Nile 6,000 years ago. Ancient black people living on the Nile 6,000 years ago. Oh, by the way, I want to create, by the way, that is a modern drawing. You won't find that was a modern person writing about the ancient Egyptian medicine, and he was just showing you in pictorial terms what their descriptions of the cardiovascular system would have ramified into. This is a clepsydra or water clock. In smaller versions, there are those who think it would have been used to measure the pulse, because the ancient Egyptians very clearly did measure the pulse. What we said about cardiovascular physiology also applies to anatomy. It is in ancient Egypt, 6,000 years ago, that you had the first systematic studies of anatomy, the first anatomy textbooks, the first anatomy anatomical lexicon. This is the skull, the external skull, and all the topographical landmarks of the skull are demarcated in a technical language. This is one of the things that is fascinating about the... This is the interior portion of the cranium, which was described by the ancient Kamites. I might just mention that they described the results of what happens to injuries to the temporal portion of the brain. The physicians in the room know that in the front part of the temporal portion of the brain is Broca's area, controlling articulate speech. Behind Broca is Wernicke's area, controlling processing and understanding of sounds and language. You get a lesion or an injury to the Broca's area, you get expressive aphasia, to Wernicke's area is receptive aphasia. Expressive aphasia means you slur your words. Receptive aphasia means that you can't understand what's being said to you, so you speak in meaningless babble. The ancient Egyptians, and by the way, an injury to both, you can get injury to both, which is total or mixed aphasia. The ancient Egyptians describing this in the Edwin Smith papyrus. So they have not only described the sort of macro surface of the brain, they had described the cortical functions of certain areas of the brain nearly 4,000 years before Broca's experiments 120 years ago, 130 years ago. Next slide. This is just the visceral anatomy. Next slide, please. From Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, what we call the postcranial skeleton. Next slide. This is case number 31 in the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, a vertebral dislocation. What is absolutely amazing about this is that the ancient Kamites describe the neurological, in medicine we say sequela, side effects or effects of this particular type of injury or insult, including paraplegia, quadriplegia, priapism, genital urinary incontinence, what they call missio-seminis, the inability to control the secretion of semen. All this is described in the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus. Now you have to understand, about 50 years ago, not even that long ago, about 30 years ago, a physician was looking at all this and he was saying, you know, today, as we speak, it would be difficult. See, one of the things you have to appreciate as a physician, that here they're able to relate a specific insult or injury or problem to a complex series of pathological outcomes. Now, this caused one physician to comment. He said, it would be difficult for us to make all these connections and correlations today without benefit of x-rays. So the question arises, how did our black African priest physicians of 6,000 years ago do so? Black African priest physicians of 6,000 years ago do so. Trepanation, a forerunner of neurosurgery, not practiced only in Africa. They practiced in, by the way, Europe, Asia, and South America. But it was also practiced among the ancient Egyptians in the Nile Valley. It was just a method by which an instrument was taken to bore through the skull into the brain to relieve intracranial pressure or to remove bone fragments from a fracture. We know that individuals survived this procedure because of the smooth margins and because of the grainy appearance around the area, around the wound, showing that there was healing. By the way, I've just finished a paper on trepanation. So-called pre-modern trepanation in places like Africa, Asia, South America had, and this goes back 5,000 years ago, had healing rates or survival rates of 80%. In 1900, in a hospital in London, the fatality rate for an exact same operation was 75%. We say, okay, Dr. Finch, this is all right, but this is all primitive, right? We don't do these things anymore. We don't have to because we got much better methods to take care of this problem. Well, that would be a good assumption, but you would be wrong because our erstwhile president, rather over 2 years ago, underwent the exact same operation to relieve intracranial pressure. We'll come back to this a little while later. For those of you who have been to ancient Egypt, or been to Egypt, excuse me, you may have been to Komombo. This is this is in the back part of that temple complex, and these are ancient Egyptian surgical instruments: knives, forceps, scalpels, scissors, probes, etc. This is an ancient Egyptian ophthalmological kit, or ophthalmological surgery instruments. Now, we know as a matter of absolute fact that 500 years ago and earlier, physicians in Mali were successfully performing cataract removal. One of the reasons, what is interesting is that in the last century, traditional physicians in southeastern Africa were also successfully removing cataracts from the eyes. Now, I surmise, and I have to say it is a surmise, that the ancient Egyptian surgeons probably performed cataract surgery as well. Can't go to court on it because we don't have any direct evidence, but I would just offer it to you as an opinion, and perhaps this instrument, these collection of instruments may have been used in cataract surgery. We know it was done elsewhere in Africa. It's not unlikely that it was also done back then in ancient Egypt. Next slide, please. Let's see, if there are any pharmacologists, pharmacists, or infectious disease specialists in the room, could you please raise your hand? No? Okay. You would really get a kick out of this, but anybody, I mean, everyone could get a kick out of it, but particularly in those areas, I think they would really get a kick out of this. This is bone slivers that have been put under a microscope, and the physicians in the room and the people in the medical sciences in the room know that bone, particularly actively mineralizing bone, takes up tetracycline very rapidly and very readily. This is the reason why, if you want to ensure that you're going to get sued by an irate parent, give that parent's child who's under 10 some tetracycline so it stains his teeth. Point is, you don't give children under 10 or 12 tetracycline because it gets taken up and stains teeth. This is a bone that fluoresces in the manner absolutely characteristic of, and mark this, therapeutic tetracycline. Okay, what does this, Dr. Finch, what does this have to do with anything? Well, that bone sliver that you see up there is 1,500 years old, and it comes from the Sudan. Now, okay, what is the mystery? No mystery. Like most antibiotics, tetracycline ultimately derives from a fungus called streptomycetes, or streptomyces. It grows naturally in the soils of Upper Egypt and the northern Sudan. The people who were exhumed to give these bone specimens were people who lived along the Nile in the northern Sudan and were intensive agriculturalists who would have stored their grains, and in these stored grains you would have had the growth of the fungus streptomycetes, which is already in the environment. So what did they do? Well, let me enrich the brew here. There were 15 individuals exhumed from this particular site. One of the things that happens when you get chronic infection or untreated infection is that around the bone you get something called periostitis. In none of these 15 individuals was there periostitis who had this fluorescing bone pattern. So they seem to be remarkably free, as the author of this article said, from infectious disease. Now, two things had to happen. Either they inadvertently and accidentally ate this mold, or they therapeutically took the mold and used it to treat infectious disease. Now you have to understand, few people eat moldy grain. If they eat grain at all, what they do, they cook it, they grind it, they mill it, they refine it, and they make bread out of it. And in any case, if they eat moldy grain, they're not going to eat enough of it to give you this therapeutic picture of tetracycline. So these people, 1,500 years ago, were taking these molds and using them as tetracycline as an antibiotic. They used to strain the virus. They used to heat the virus. They actually used to attenuate the virus. When I say the virus, they used to get samples, pustule samples from someone who was affected by smallpox and then inoculate it with a pinprick into unaffected individuals. But apparently, in some cultures, they used to actually do something to the virus to actually weaken its effect. So it wouldn't give you the disease, it would only give you the immune response. So here we have a people in so-called darkest Africa understanding the concepts of contagion, immunity, and vaccination. Hundreds of years before they became operative scientific concepts in European medicine with Pasteur and Koch. These are various kinds of surgery practiced in traditional Africa, particularly in East Africa. We won't dwell too long. These are various East African surgical instruments. In particular, I want you to pay attention to the implement on the right, the burning iron, the cautery iron, because it becomes important right about now. As I say, my pièce de résistance, my crowning glory. I won't say mine, but since I'm presenting it, I call it mine. Because if there's any single, if someone said, Dr. Finch, show one slide to make your entire point, it would be this one, of all the ones that I've shown. R.W. Falcon, a medical missionary traveling in Uganda in 1879, interested in traditional obstetrics, came upon this scene in a village in the Banyoro Kingdom of Uganda and was allowed to witness it. Woman, 20 years old, first pregnancy, in labor 3 days without progress. 3 men, one holding her abdomen, the other holding her stomach, and the other, as you see the surgeon, poised with a knife. Mutters an incantation, takes banana wine, alcohol, washes his hands with it, washes the abdomen with it, then proceeds to cut her from the xiphoid process down to the pubis symphysis in what today is called a classical incision. Takes the cautery irons one by one, sealing off the bleeding points, opens up the peritoneum, opens up the uterus, takes out the baby, cuts the cord, clamps it, hands the infant to an assistant, then seals off the bleeding points again with the cautery iron that I showed you, turns the woman over on her side so the amniotic fluid would spill out, turns her back on her back, takes his fingers and goes inside the uterus and dilates the cervix from within. Now, the obstetricians and gynecologists in the room know what the significance of that is. You have to do that in order to let postpartum blood escape. Again, sealing off the bleeding points with red-hot cautery irons, then closing the uterus and the abdomen with 7 sharp spikes. Falcon observed mother and child for 11 days. The mother had 2 days of fever, which disappeared, and after 11 days, mother and child were alive and well. An elective cesarean section like this, elective, was not even done routinely in Europe until 20 years later. As Falcon himself said, Lister, the so-called founder of modern antiseptic surgery, his team could hardly have performed with greater smoothness. Falcon's informants say this was custom among their peoples, that when a woman could not push a baby out, they would hand her over to the surgeon. This has been going on for generations. This was no fluke. In fact, Falcon says you couldn't get this level of coordination and professionalism and surgical skill without a tried and true operation that had been going on for a long time. The surgeon obviously understood the concepts of anesthesia, antisepsis. He used wine, that is alcohol, to clean the surface and his hands, and hemorrhage control. Now, the anesthesia is the most confusing part, because the only thing that they will say is that that Falcon noticed, I should say, is that she was given a concoction of banana wine. But the only time she made a noise is when the surgeon introduced the knife at the beginning. She made a little noise in her throat, and then for the rest of the operation, she did not utter a sound, even though she was awake. So there was something else in that concoction than just grog. I don't even rule out the possibility there may have been, shall we say, psychogenic or hypnotic factors involved. You know, the neurologists in the room and the psychiatrists in the room, people like Pat Newton and others, know about endorphins, et cetera, et cetera. These are the biochemical substances within the body, created by the body, that cause anesthesia, that are released by things such as acupuncture. I'm speculating a little bit here, but I mean, I think all of this is a worthy speculation. The point is that this is a landmark, not merely in African surgery, this is a landmark in surgery, in a place at that time which was being called Darkest Africa. Had surgical technique that Europe had not, or America had not even achieved up to that time. You can see why, if I have to use one slide out of the 180 slides I have on African medicine, I would choose this one and this one alone. This is an artist's conception of what the woman looked like afterwards with the 7 sharp spikes. And that knife is the actual knife used in the operation. It is now in the Burroughs Wellcome Museum in London. This is just from Nigeria. This is like a birthing center, if you will, a traditional birthing center. We could do an hour and a half just on traditional African obstetrics, but one of the things I can tell you is that no one ever in Africa gives birth in what I call the anti-gravity position, or better known in medical circles as dorsal lithotomy, which to me, dorsal lithotomy, which to me means that it is convenient to the obstetrician, is not necessarily the best way of delivering a baby. But don't want to get on my soapbox about that. Nonetheless, in Africa, and that goes back in ancient Egypt, they always either sit, stand, or kneel when they deliver. This is just a sculpture again showing a woman in the process of delivering or in the process of labor. I had to throw a couple of these slides in at the end because I forgot to put them in sequence. I just wanted to show them. This is UT, court physician from the time of Ramesses. Significant because of this particular scene on his tomb showing his assistants making his medicinal concoctions, etc. This is one of my favorites, Peseshet, an eminent lady from antiquity who herself was a trained physician, not merely a trained physician, but became chief of physicians. Someone once said, well, Dr. Finch, if you say Imhotep is the father of medicine, Peseshet should be the mother of medicine. Well, I say I can't really argue with that, so let it be. This is a artist's conception of a Père Ankh based on the temple of Edfu. Père Ankh, called the House of Life, was essentially not only a temple, but in effect a hospital and medical school for the training of the priest physicians.